Hey everyone, my name is Eric Manning, and you're watching Sunday School Apologetics. And today we are talking about a very simple proof for Christianity. I'm warning you, though, you're going to be very tempted to dismiss it because it is just very uncomplicated. Are you ready? All right, here we go. Paul converted, therefore Christianity is true. Now, I'm kidding, sort of. I do think that we sometimes fail to appreciate the evidential power of Paul's conversion, though. And it was investigating Paul's story is what turned a former self-proclaimed infidel into a believer and a Christian apologist. And it is a guy by the name of George Lyttleton who lived in the 18th century. Now, he was born in a small town of Hagley, England. He was a prolific poet and writer. Lyttleton was an Oxford graduate. He was also a statesman who served as a member of Parliament. And he had a friend by the name of Gilbert West. Now, this was during the Age of Reason when deism was all the rage. Now, for those of you who don't know, deism is the belief that God exists, he created the world, but he doesn't reveal himself in a revealed type of way like you find in Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. He's only basically found in nature, and he doesn't directly communicate to people through miracles and revelation. Now, West and Lyttleton were both critical of Christianity, and together the two set out to disprove it. They both agreed that the two strongest proofs or evidences for the faith were the resurrection of Jesus and the conversion of St. Paul. So Lyttleton offered to disprove Paul's conversion, and West set out to discount the resurrection. Well, guess what happened? After doing so, to their own shock and perhaps dismay, they both became Christians. West wrote, these guys were pen pals with one another, and he said that as I investigated the evidence for the resurrection, I have come to believe that there's something to it, and I'm going to write a book from that perspective. And Lyttleton wrote, the same thing happened to me. I've come to see that there was something to the conversion of St. Paul, and I'm going to write my book from the same perspective. And so they did. And these are the two books. Lyttleton's book is titled The Observations on the Conversion and Apostleship of St. Paul. And I will link it in the description down below. You can get it on Google Play for absolutely free. It's at no charge, and it is a short read. It's only about 70 pages, and that's not including introductions and all kinds of other things. And so this book will only take you about an hour, maybe 2 hours at the most to read. Now, obviously, Lyttleton's argument was a little more complicated than Paul, therefore Christianity is true. He looked at Paul's life in Acts and the epistles and concluded there are 4 possible explanations for his conversion. Now, bear with me on the 18th century speak here, but Lyttleton writes either Paul was an impostor who said what he knew was false with the intent to deceive, or he was an enthusiast who imposed on himself by the force of an overheated imagination. In other words, Paul was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, or he was deceived by the fraud of others, so he was lied to, he believed lies, or what he declared to be the cause of his conversion did really happen, and therefore the Christian religion is a divine revelation. So these are the 4 options. And if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis's trilemma, liar, lunatic, Lord, this is very similar logic. It's a quadrilemma. And we're going to look at these different options and see, was Paul a deceiver? Was he crazy? Was he hallucinating something? Or was he tricked by others? Or is he telling us the truth? And so we'll start with whether or not Paul was a deceiver. Now, think about why people would want to start basically a cult and foist it upon others. One of the reasons is it would be for the money. Well, Paul wasn't in it for the Benjamins, bad pun intended. He was of the tribe of Benjamin, for those of you who know your Bible a little bit there. But we know that Paul wasn't in it for the money. Well, how do we know that? Well, he tells us, and it's pretty clear. In 1 Corinthians 4:11 through 12, it says, to this very hour we go hungry and thirsty, we're in rags, we're brutally treated, we're homeless, we work hard with our own hands. Now, if you know the book of Acts, Paul made tents, and he did this to finance those who were traveling with him. Paul would work hard day and night in order to support himself rather than just relying on the support of the churches. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 9, 6 through 14, he says that the Lord commanded those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But Paul says, I haven't used any of these rights. And I'm not writing this in hope that you will do such things for me, for I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. Then what is my reward? Just in this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. And so Paul was saying that according to the Lord himself, I have a right to receive offerings and to be supported from you guys, but I would rather be an example, work hard with my own hands, support myself, and not have you support me so as to cause any hindrance to the gospel going forward. Well, what about the fame? What about status and the honor of men? Well, it's hard to imagine that Paul was in it for his own personal reputation. Consider why he persecuted the church in the first place. A band of fishermen was saying that the Jewish Messiah was executed on the cross, and this Jesus was now the Lord of all. And he went from being schooled under Gamaliel and being considered a reputable Pharisee to joining a band of basically illiterate preachers. And he also said that the preaching of the cross was foolishness, and it was a stumbling block to the Jews and just foolishness to the Greeks, to the Gentiles. And so he was publicly treated like a criminal everywhere that he went. 1 Corinthians 4, 9 through 13, it says that it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena. We've been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to human beings. We are fools for Christ, but you are so wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. We are honored, but you are honored, We are dishonored. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty. We're in rags. We're brutally treated. We're homeless. We work hard with our own hands. We are cursed. We blessed. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to this moment. So everywhere Paul went, he was being persecuted by the Jews, by the Gentiles. They would reject his message, and he was a vagabond preacher. It's really hard to say that he was in it for any sort of status. And if you read 2 Corinthians 11:23, and again, these are letters that Paul wrote to the churches. These are occasional letters to people that knew him, and it would be really hard for him to just make up goofy stories. These people had heard of Paul's persecutions and knew the things that he went through. And in this chapter, the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians, he talks about being in prison, being flogged, being exposed to death again and again. He received 40 lashes minus one, 5 times from the Jews. 3 times he was beaten with rods. He was once stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. He spent a day and night in the open sea. He's constantly on the move. He's in danger from rivers, in dangers from bandits, in dangers from his fellow countrymen, the Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in the country, and at sea, and from false believers. He labored and toiled and have gone without sleep. He's known hunger and thirst and has gone without food. He has been cold and destitute and just basically underclothed. And so Paul went through a lot. Clearly, he was not in it for any sort of status. Now, what about power? Was Paul like a lot of these modern day church leaders who are in it for power and are lording it over other churches and different things like that and trying to control people's lives? Well, no. Paul said he wasn't even worthy to be called an apostle because he persecuted the church. That's in 1 Corinthians 15:9. And even when people were proclaiming the gospel from wrong motives when he was in prison, he rejoiced. When he was writing to the Philippians, he says that while he was in jail, some preached Christ out of envy and rivalry, and others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? Paul says the important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. And so Paul was just excited and happy that people were preaching Christ at all, even if their motives were bad. He wasn't trying to say, no, don't listen to these poor motive preachers, just follow me. He was just happy that the gospel was getting out. And in 2 Corinthians 3-4, he wrote to the Corinthians, this church that he had planted, and he was irritated with them because there was factions between them. For one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos. And he says, are you not acting as mere human beings? What, after all, is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants or the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. For the one who plants and the one who waters has one purpose, and they will be rewarded according to their own labor. We're co-workers in God's service. And so Paul is saying, listen, you guys, stop arguing over who your favorite preacher is, because they were saying, well, I follow Peter, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Paul. And you have this super spiritual people saying, well, I only follow Jesus. We see people like this to this day arguing over who their favorite preacher is. And Paul was saying, hey, you guys, this is ridiculous. We're all servants of Christ, and just follow the gospel. And so Paul clearly wasn't in it to lord over others. Even in Acts, when he was in Lystra and he healed a crippled man, the people tried to worship him as a god, and he quickly put a stop to it. And so he wasn't looking to lord it over people. He was looking to serve others. There's also 1 Thessalonians 2:9, where he says that you are witnesses, and so is God, how we lived holy and blameless before them. And he said that he dealt with them as a father who deals with their own children, encouraging and comforting them. And so, again, Paul was just in it to serve others. Well, what about passion, if you know what I mean? Was Paul in it for the girls, or for sexual power or lust? We do see people who start cults and are in it to get women as well as wealth and have power over people. Well, we know from his letters that Paul actually was celibate. In 1 Corinthians 9:5 says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as the other apostles do, and the Lord's brothers, and Cephas or Peter? And so these other apostles and church leaders had wives. Paul decided to forgo that right. Even to the Corinthians, he said, I wish that you were all as I am, but each one has his own gift from God. And so Paul said that his gift was of celibacy was to help him be undistracted in his service to the Lord. And so Paul also was very explicit about his condemnation for sexual immorality. We see this all throughout his letters. And so Paul clearly wasn't in it for the sex. And compare that to like the Prophet Muhammad, which I believe he had 9 or 11 wives. I'm going off memory. I should know this one. And then you have Joseph Smith, one of his successors, Brigham Young, who had 42 wives. Clearly, there's something kind of weird going on there. And so, in comparison, Paul is like a shining light compared to these guys. So, was Paul just making up pious lies? You know, was he just making up weird stories to, I don't know, make others and himself feel better about their lives? And so I don't think that could possibly be the case. Lyttleton, in his book, appeals to the story of Paul's conversion found in Acts. While no one else on the road of Damascus, or the road to Damascus, saw Jesus, his traveling companions had some sensory experience of Paul's encounter. And Paul himself was also blinded and subsequently healed by the prayers of Ananias. And even before King Agrippa, Paul appealed to public facts that the king would be aware of. And not only that, but if Paul was just making up stories, that doesn't really explain his miracles. They must have been tricks if that was the case. But Paul wrote of his own miracles to an audience that easily could have called him out. In 2 Corinthians 12:12, he says that he demonstrated among them the marks of a true apostle, including signs, miracles, and wonders. Well, they could have easily called shenanigans on this. He also makes similar statements in Romans 15:19, 1 Thessalonians 1:5, and 1 Corinthians 2:4-5. And so, for these reasons, Lyttleton concludes that the weight of the evidence is that Paul clearly wasn't a liar. And I'll say this, I will add that no credible historian who studies early Christianity thinks that Paul wasn't sincere. Everybody believes that he truly did believe that the resurrected Jesus appeared to him and that he was absolutely sincere. And he did so to his own death, which historians say happened under the persecutions of Nero in around 62 to 64 AD. And so Paul just wasn't a liar. Liars tend to make poor martyrs. So we can go ahead and rule that out and move to the next option. Was he an enthusiast imposed by the force of an overheated imagination? I wish I could say that in like a really cool Elizabethan British accent there. Just can't really pull that one off. But was Paul cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs? Was he crazy? Was he nuts? Well, no. Lyttleton argues that Paul wasn't crazy. And he says here that in indifferent matters, Paul became all things to all men. To the Jews he became a Jew, to those without the law as without the law. To the weak he became weak, also that he may gain some. Lyttleton says that his zeal was eager and warm, but tempered with prudence, even with the civilities and decorums of life, as appears by his behavior to Agrippa, Festus, and Felix, not the blind, inconsiderate, indecent zeal of an enthusiast. And so Paul doesn't appear to just be like full of crazy self-importance and have some sort of a messiah complex or anything else like that. He was a very rational and very cool guy overall. Well, what about depression? Was Paul depressed? Well, even when he despaired of life given the nature of his persecutions, he didn't give up. Lyttleton points out that Paul obviously, even though he suffered a great many things, continued in his ministry because he wanted to serve others. And we read in Philippians 1:21-23 that Paul says, "For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what will I choose? I don't know. I'm torn between the two. I have a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." And Paul, even writing in prison, and this is in Philippians, which every scholar believes that he wrote while he was in prison, says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice." So even while he was in prison, Paul was in great spirits. And so he wasn't like just so clouded by depression that he was this delusional kind of person. Now, what about Paul being just stupid or just really credulous? Is that a possibility? Well, Paul obviously was very highly educated. Anybody who reads his writings knows that he was an extremely learned man. He was learned in Grecian and Jewish learning. And if you've ever read his sermon on Mars Hill, we can see that he quotes the Greek philosophers. The man just knows his stuff. He knows the scriptures. He was very, very highly educated as a Pharisee. He also commanded the respect of Agrippa and Felix. When they listened to him and allowed him to testify and give a defense for why he was imprisoned, he captured their attention. And they could see that he was obviously a very learned and educated man. The other thing about Paul is we know that he was in the place to know, and he wasn't somebody who was just very easily duped or a credulous kind of person. Now, this is a quote by William Frederick Farrar, I believe he was a Scottish minister in the 19th century. And he writes, He had heard again and again, this is referring to Paul, the proofs which satisfied Annas and Gamaliel that Jesus was a deceiver of the people. The events on which the apostles relied in proof of his divinity had taken place in the full blaze of contemporary knowledge. He had not to deal with uncertainties or of criticism or assaults on their authenticity. He could question not ancient documents, but living men. He could analyze not fragmentary records, but existing evidence. He had thousands of means close at hand, whereby he could test the reality or unreality of the resurrection, which unto this time he had passionately and contemptuously disbelieved. In accepting this half-crushed and wholly execrated faith, I hope I said that right, he had everything in the world to lose, and he had nothing conceivable to gain. Yet, in spite of all, overwhelmed by the conviction he felt to be irresistible, Saul, the Pharisee, became witness of the resurrection, a preacher of the cross. I just think that's a very, very powerful quote. And so here's the point. Paul had heard about what had happened at Pentecost. He had heard of the miracles worked by Peter and the other apostles right up to the death of Stephen. And as Stephen was being stoned, he stood there approvingly according to Acts. And so Paul had every means, even after the vision. He could investigate. He could dig. He could ask witnesses. And we do know in the book of Galatians that he did meet with Peter and James and John. And in Corinthians, he refers to the Lord's brothers. And so he had these witnesses that he could test and ask questions about. And even if he had any doubts of his vision, he had these men that he could draw from. And so I think this is just a very powerful proof that Paul, had this amazing evidence of the resurrection before him. And so here is Lyttleton. He says, nothing less than the irresistible evidence of his own senses, clear from all possibility of doubt, could have overcome his belief. So no, Paul wasn't credulous. So what about a modern objection? Some people have said they've tried to psychologize Paul, and they'll say, well, maybe he had conversion disorder. As he was traveling about, maybe he was just tired and stressed from arresting all of these different Christians, and maybe he was starting to feel guilty about his actions, and Paul just had some sort of conversion disorder experience, and that caused him to hallucinate something. Well, this is a medical textbook from the American Psychiatric Association, and it says that women are 5 to 1 more likely to experience conversion psychosis. Well, we know Paul wasn't a woman. Adolescents, military persons in battle, people of low economic status, and those with a low IQ are also more likely prone to experience this phenomenon. And again, this is from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Well, Paul doesn't check any of these boxes. And so it's very unlikely that this is a good explanation for what Paul experienced. Paul also seemed to have felt no remorse or guilt for what he was doing. And in Philippians, he says that concerning the righteousness of the law, he was faultless. And he seemed more than happy to be in the life that he lived as a Pharisee and as somebody persecuting the church. So Paul just isn't a good candidate for this kind of conversion disorder. So here we are we've looked at the first two options. Paul was either an imposter or a liar, or Paul was crazy. And I think we can rule out the first two pretty safely. And so what about being deceived by the fraud of others? Was Paul tricked into believing that he saw Jesus and Christianity is true? Well, this very goofy explanation Lyttleton dismisses in one page of his book. The other apostles or early Christians wouldn't have deceived him. Why? Well, it was impossible that the disciples of Christ could have thought of such a fraud given Paul's persecution. They were against liars. Just think about Ananias and Sapphira and what happened there. And they were also extremely terrified of Paul. And so that's just very unlikely that they would try and trick him. Also, how exactly are they going to do that? It's pretty much physically impossible. Could they produce a light that's brighter than the noonday sun? No. Could they cause him to hear a voice speaking out of that light? No. I mean, I don't think that ventriloquism was probably a perfected art at that point. Neither was pyrotechnics or special effects of any sort in order to make this happen. Well, could they also make him blind for 3 days and then return his sight with a word, as with what happened with Ananias? No, again, that doesn't make any sense. Also, Lyttleton says that no fraud could have produced the subsequent miracles that Paul worked. We already touched on that. Paul firmly believed that he performed miracles and would talk about these miracles as if the churches already knew all about them. And not only that, but Paul even incidentally writes to the Galatians in Galatians 3:5 and to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 12 that they were experiencing healings and working of miracles, that they were aware of these gifts that were taking place in their churches. And so this particular explanation is just too goofy to be rational. And so if Paul wasn't deceived by the fraud of others, and if he wasn't crazy, and if he wasn't himself a liar, then Lyttleton concludes that the cause of his conversion was legit, and the Christian religion is indeed a divine revelation. To conclude, Lyttleton says, I shall take it for granted that Paul was not deceived by the fraud of others, that what he said of himself cannot be imputed to the power of deceit, no more than to willful imposture or to enthusiasm, and then it follows from what he related to have been the cause of his conversion and to have happened in consequence of it really did happen. Therefore, the Christian religion is a divine revelation. And so that is Lyttleton's argument. Now, you might say that we're assuming that the book of Acts is reliable and that the accounts in Acts, it has come under assault, under modern criticism. And so I am going to put a card, and also in the description down below, a video by Dr. Tim McGrew where he goes through a lot of the different cases made against the reliability of Acts, and then he makes a very strong case for the historical reliability of Acts. So you're definitely going to want to watch that. Also, if you want some good books on the topic of the reliability of Acts, Craig Keener's commentaries on Acts, I hope you can break out your wallet for that one. This is a 4-volume commentary, and Keener just has historical fact after historical fact after historical fact that is confirmed by Luke. Plus, it's just an amazing commentary. So you can get your hands on that. Or cheaper, but still a little on the pricier side, is Colin Hemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. I will link that in the description down below. I have a copy of that. It is extremely great. And there is a chapter where he goes through 84 facts of historical facts that Luke gets right, that proves that he was an eyewitness, things about just all of the explicit details that Luke would have to know as a traveling companion of Paul and where they had went. I will also put in the description down below a link to those 84 facts that you can just look at briefly. Also, check out Lydia McGrew's book, Hidden in Plain View, where she talks about undesigned coincidences between the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul. It's this like internal bits and details that you'll read from Acts, and then it'll raise a question that's answered in the letters of Paul and vice versa, that shows that Acts is reliable, historically reliable. And so do check those out. And that, I believe, really buttresses Lyttleton's argument, which I think is a really good argument, even if it is, a few hundred years old. And so I hope this video was beneficial to you. If it was, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave me a comment down below. Also, I am on Patreon, and so any support that you can offer there does help me cover some of my hosting costs and different equipment costs and things like that. You can also check out my website, isjesusalive.com, or if you go to my Patreon page, I don't do subscriber-based content. Everything that you that I create, you have 100% access to, because as Paul said, as we read in this, I believe the gospel is free of charge. And so I want you to be able to have all of my materials for free. I don't do any sort of special behind the scenes stuff. If you support me, it just goes into the work of the ministry. And I thank you very much for watching.